Hello, magical people of the internet. I am Jen, and welcome to my vlog, I Never Thought I Would, where we talk about doing things we never thought we would do and the unexpected places that they can lead us to. I have a fabulous guest today. She is a Canadian urban fantasy author, Kristi Charish. She is a Canadian urban fantasy author. She also has her master's degree in molecular biology and biochemistry and a PhD in zoology. Hi, Kristi.
Hey, Jennifer, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun.
I know, I'm so fascinated by your science background. That's really a different field from most authors I talk to.
It's, you know what? It's actually not as off the trail as you might think it is. There's actually a fair number of scientists out there who write who are prominent fiction authors. Some of the favorite examples I always like to give are Michael Crichton, who had a medical degree and then was doing his dinosaurs.
I think I was aware of that.
Yeah. And Dinah Gabaldon had I believe, a marine biology, who does, of course, the Outlander series, has marine biology. And then there's Peter Watts from up at UBC, another alumni from UBC, who is another prominent Canadian sci-fi author. So we're out there.
It definitely makes sense because, sci-fi, urban fantasy, whether it has like the science fiction aspect or a little bit of the supernatural aspect, it would make sense, that a scientist could have this kind of crazy imagination that would go in directions where like lay people wouldn't go because we're just not versed in that, in that realm.
I think the science sometimes gives people confidence to make things up. But I think there is a really creative component to the sciences. So when you're doing research, you often are asking questions that you have no idea what the answer is. You might have guesses what the answer is, but you're kind of having to use your imagination and the creative components of, the creative parts of your brain to imagine what the answers, the possible outcomes of your experiments might be. And you spend 10 years doing that, and plotting a novel doesn't look as different, after you've sort of spent your years in the science trenches. So I find a lot of similarities to plotting a novel. You've got a bit of a structure, like you've got a set of almost like game rules that you have to follow when you're doing science, because there is a lot of knowledge out there. And I kind of find that too with a novel. You got those game rules. You got to have a character, you got to tell a story. Some of the rules you can break. And I think that's what drew me to writing.
That's really exciting. So I can actually see how it's a transferable skill, even though it's not a natural connection I would make, because it is, you totally, in science, what's the scientific method? It's like you come up with a hypothesis of like why something is like this. And then you basically have to tell the story as to why it is or why it isn't through your experimentation and your research. But it's not a natural conclusion because for some reason in society, we're told you're either science-minded and mathematically minded or you're creative. You're kind of an academic or you're kind of a creative. We don't fit into boxes so easily, do we?
No, we really don't. But I love what you say just about the experimental method, because I've often used as an example that the experimental method is very much a good test run for deciding whether or not something works in your novel. You come up with your hypothesis, would the character do this? For particular, you can either do it for the entire novel, or you can do sort of a smaller hypothesis for the individual scenes. And whether or not you buy it, or your audience or your first readers buy it, tells you whether or not you need to go back to the drawing board and come up with a different hypothesis, or whether or not that scene works. So yeah, it is really transferable. And it's weird how society does that with science, isn't it?
Yeah. They like to make, I feel like the narrative when it comes to math and science is, ooh, that's really hard. That's really hard. It's too difficult for the average person to understand. But I don't think so at all. Like, I've always been creative. I've been writing since I was a kid. I was always into performance, but I really excelled in math and science. And actually in school, I did much better in the maths and sciences than I did in like the arts or the humanities, in terms of like essay writing. Anything I had to write an essay, I did so poorly. Anything that was like a mathematical equation, no problem.
It's funny. So, that actually leads in really well to the question of I never thought what I never thought I would do. Becoming a geneticist. If somebody had told me I was going to become a geneticist when I started off in my university degree, I would have told them they were nuts. And even after I'd switched to the sciences from archaeology, I'd switched to ecology, which is, again, the perception is it's sort of the softer biology is kind of perceived as this softer science. So I kind of eased myself from the arts, which is where archaeology, anthropology was, into ecology and biology, and I felt a little comfortable there. And I remember getting my first, I had to take genetics, and genetics was the next course that I needed in order to graduate. And I was dreading it. I had the textbook with me that I took while I was doing an ecology. We were looking at porpoises in, I was doing like an undergrad assistantship. We were looking at porpoises in the San Juan Islands. So I was going around the boats and you get to follow them. And it was a lot of fun. But I've got this textbook, this giant textbook in my backpack, because I was so terrified of taking my first genetics class, because I was thinking math, probability, all the things I've been told I was really bad at throughout my high school career.
That's encouraging.
And through my university, even when because I had to, in order to switch from anthropology, archaeology, which had required no math, and it required no mathematics and no chemistry, which is why I went with anthropology. When I went from high school to when I switched from high school to first year university,
anthropology is more like behavior.
Anthropology, archaeology is more like behavior and, sort of fun things like that.
Yeah, like stuff on a molecular level of like why this gene is, dominant and why this one's recessive, and, how did we phase out this part of our genetics and how did this become stronger?
Yeah. And so, anthropology, archaeology was kind of it was still very much an arts. It was, there was some biology involved, which I was drawn to. I'd always been drawn to biology. I'd always loved biology, and I'm good at biology. I always excelled in my biology class, and I always excelled in my arts classes. I was very much the drama major in high school. Like, speaking of high school, English literature, creative stuff like creative writing, art, all of that kind of stuff I was interested in. Western civilization, sort of those typically more creative classes. And one of the reasons is I just didn't do well in math, physics, and chemistry were my nemesis throughout all high school. And part of it was, this is back in the, from elementary school, so elementary school up to high school, 80s and 90s. It was still kind of okay to tell girls that they weren't, if you were a girl who excelled at math and you were a natural at it, well, that was okay. It was just like, all right, you're going to be fine. Yes, girls can be good at these particular, courses, but it was also still okay if you weren't a natural at it to be able to tell girls that, well, you know what, girls might not be as good at this. Boys tend to be better at this. Girls aren't necessarily as good at this. So why don't you try the arts and the literature type classes? And so I kind of held that with me all throughout high school. And when I did come up with difficulties in those more mathematical classes, it ended up being very discouraging for me, because it was like, all right, I'm not naturally good at this, so I should stay away from these classes. And I really just looked at the things that I was naturally good at. because of that discouragement. It wasn't like you're having trouble with this, so let's figure out why, because you can do this just as much as the other students. It was, maybe you should concentrate on something else. So going into university, anthropology, archaeology, I was really interested in, for the evolution of, humans and our civilization and all that stuff. And I'm still quite interested in that, archaeology and old civilizations and such. But I started getting sort of encouraged towards the sciences in my very first year of anthropology, because we ended up with one of the world's experts in primatology was our first year instructor.
Cool.
In orangutan. So we ended up getting an introduction to primatology and human evolution, kind of like what you're talking about, that, the genes and how did things evolve. And I was really drawn to that. So I sort of meandered my way into biology. And again, still really, I guess, reticent to even look at mathematics, and still thinking I was really awful at it. So a few years later, and passing my math to get into university, for my first year math, because of course I had no math from high school. Yeah. I had just not done it, because it was like, well, there was also this thing of punishment. So, and I this is something I really have a problem with our education system. And I know I'm going on about this now, but, if you have difficulty with a particular subject and you want to go to university, if you take a provincial exam, in BC, and you do poorly on it, well, that means that's going to reflect poorly on you when you apply to university. So you're punished for taking a class that you might have struggle with, which I think is a real shame, because it meant that I was completely discouraged from even attempting to do math, chemistry, and physics, because, oh my gosh, if I got a C, well, that was going to ruin my chances at getting into university. Whereas if I just did English literature and biology, the things I knew I was good at, it meant that I would be able to, to succeed. And I think that's a real shame. But
sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Yeah, please.
Do you think they do that with the maths and the sciences because they just don't expect everybody to be able to grasp those things? Because if somebody's not doing well in like a humanities class or something, like history, sociology, something like that, nobody's going to say, oh, just don't take those classes. You know what I mean? Like, we're expected to be able to know history. We're expected to be able to know, grammar. And whereas the maths and sciences are considered so specialized that the average person probably won't excel in them anyways. So they're discouraged.
I think your idea is on the right track. I have a slightly different take on it from, again, the author part of my brain.
Yeah.
And that's that all those classes that you mentioned, and including biology, I think because of the way we look at biology and the way it's taught, all of those courses, the humanities, and again, biology, ecology, physics, those sorts of things, anything to do with an animal or, the world around us, the environment, we can turn it into a narrative. We can turn it into a story. And we know that we learn really well from stories.
Yeah.
So you can always find a story that you can teach somebody about those topics, whether it's history, whether it's, a Western Civ, whether it's an animal and its life cycle. And you can figure out an interesting story that will eventually resonate with somebody. And I think math, chemistry, and physics, it's always been harder to do that, to figure out what's the story you can tell about these subjects. And I think it can be done. I've seen talented chemistry teachers do that at the university level, but it's not intuitive in the way that we teach it in school. And I think that's why I don't know, that may be a reason why.
Okay.
And maybe that they're considered more masculine.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm going to reel us back now because I want to talk more about how you never thought you would become a geneticist. So is there one particular experiment or hypothesis that you were working on, that you can tell us about, just to give us a little bit of insight into what you did as a geneticist?
One of sort of the best ways that I find to describe genetics is it's kind of the story of how a cell works, how our bodies work on a cellular level, because it's looking at the genes in our DNA that runs us. What I basically used to do is I joke that I used to sit there and break things all day and then figure out what I had broken and how it fits into the rest of the cell. So I used to work on fruit flies, the wonderful model organism called the fruit fly. What I used to do is I would do a lot of genetic crosses, which is a bit like playing Tetris, but on a populations. We'd keep the flies in these wonderful little containers where they've got their food, they've got all sorts of place to fly, and you'd sort of look at them on these generational type. You look at their genes and how they evolved on this generation type type scale. And what I used to do was some of my very favorite experiments had to do with the architecture of a cell and how cells with a really set architecture. So imagine a hair cell where the hair's got to be up top and then it's got to get all its nutrients from the bottom and from blood vessels. How do those cells divide while still keeping everything where it's supposed to go? And I used flies to do that. So I would try and break things that were involved in those processes and see if anything happened.
Wow, that's really cool. So how many fruit flies do you think you had in your lab? Hundreds?
Over my entire career, billions, I'm sure.
Wow.
I used to have boxes full of them. And of course, they've got a very quick life cycle. So,
yes,
you're kind of playing, there's kind of a godlike component to it because you've got, these billions and billions of flies that you work with over the years. But yeah, I really enjoyed the storytelling part. So figuring out what story I wanted to tell about the experiment I was doing.
Well, speaking of stories, why don't we get into talking about your 2 book series? So your first series is the Owl series, and then the second series is Kinkade Strange. So which one did you begin first?
Owl, so The Adventures of Owl is what I began first. The first book was Owl in the Japanese Circus, and I wrote that while I was doing my PhD thesis. So that's when I started writing sort of as a fun hobby, and I would write a bit of my book while I wrote my thesis. And Owl the series is about an ex-archaeology graduate student turned international antiquities thief who has one rule: no supernatural jobs ever. And of course, the series is her exploits being dragged into under the sort of the hidden supernatural world. And all of these artifacts, of course, which have supernatural origins.
I was going to say, it's kind of hard to get into archaeology without touching on some sort of mysticism, because just so many of the cultures from thousands of years ago, they didn't have science the way we do today, in order to prove why things are the way they are. So there was a lot of supernatural belief and a lot of power attributed to unexplained spirits or demons or what have you.
And places and things and creatures. And it's a very fun premise. I think that's maybe why so many archaeology type, or ancient artifact type movies and books. 2 of my favorites, of course, are the Indiana Jones series and The Mummy.
Yeah, The Mummy is phenomenal too.
Which it's one of my all-time favorite movies, and it fits in really nicely. That whole supernatural. It's a very as you said, it's a very natural fit. And but yeah, my other series, Kinkade Strange, is more of a murder mystery, urban fantasy murder mystery, and it's about Kinkade Strange, who is a practitioner of the dead in who lives in Seattle with the ghost of a grunge rocker, and the series kicks off with a bunch of murders happening in the paranormal community. So Kinkade raises ghosts and zombies for things like will disputes. And when people in the city start turning up dead, then she starts to investigate. First off, because she doesn't want something bad to happen to her, and she's been asked by people in the paranormal community. But second, she also doesn't want to be blamed for it or end up the next victim. So that's a lot of ghosts and a lot of ghostly sort of mysteries, and zombies are in that particular series.
Okay, what do you mean when you said she raises ghosts?
Oh, she summons ghosts and raises zombies. I misspoke. So
oh no, maybe I heard you incorrectly. So she summons ghosts to do her bidding for her.
Not so much her bidding, more to ask them questions. It's hard to get a ghost to do anything that it doesn't want to do.
But so she can get in touch with them to try and solve real world problems or mysteries.
Yep, and it's, for me, it was I started off the series sort of on a writing prompt, but as I sort of thought about it, it's like, well, if you actually had somebody who could communicate with the other side, the land of the dead, and raise zombies, so very thinking zombies is what I like to think about them. So bodies where the ghosts have been bound to them for all eternity. And you have ghosts as well. What if they actually existed? What would people really want to use them for? And it sort of occurred to me that if a ghost or a zombie was sort of an everyday occurrence, well, you'd have university students calling up a practitioner to raise them a zombie to go on a beer run, for sure. A zombie, of course, who had ID,
like zombie butlers almost.
Yeah, and people would want, and this is something Kinkade's roommate runs into a lot of problems with, because he's an ex-grunge star from the 90s, and his music company occasionally, and his old bandmates will occasionally maybe hire a ghost finder to try and get him back for one last show or for a next set of recordings, and he just doesn't want to. So
yeah. Oh my God, this sounds like so much fun. You've got a phenomenal imagination. This supernatural elements of the Owl series sound fascinating, but they sound like they're rooted, they're kind of grounded in some sort of earthly truth, so to speak, because they come from like an artifact or a place. So they're just, but the whole zombie ghost thing, like, that just sounds crazy, raising zombies. Like, you have such a fascinating imagination. Where did you come up with these things? Like, I can understand the Indiana Jane one, as you called it earlier, because you studied archaeology and, and things like that. But so are you a medium? Do you summon ghosts?
No, nothing like that. I sort of relegate the supernatural to, I think the human imagination is a phenomenal thing. And I think everybody has, a ghost scare or ghost story. I relegate that to, my imagination is a fantastic thing. My brain is this amazing organism, or part of my body, part of my fascinating organ. And it's able to, the input that it receives, that my body receives, our brains are always looking for a solution. And so that's how I consider the supernatural world, is it's our brains trying to come up with a solution for all of this information that's coming in. And I find that fascinating. I think the imagination is just such a wonderful thing. I love fantasy. I fantasy and sci-fi have always kind of been my go-to for reading, and video games and things like that. So for me, it's a natural fit. I think I enjoy the challenge that urban fantasy brings of trying to come up with, coming up with these crazy sort of fantastical ideas, and then figuring out, okay, well, how would that actually fit into the real world?
Yeah,
What
making them
space would it,
plausible for the
yeah,
audience to buy, like,
yeah,
and I mean buy as in buy into the idea,
yeah,
because there are lots of supernatural, sci-fi, fantasy stories, movies, books that just kind of miss the mark because you have to surrender to wanting to buy in to that world that you're reading, or else you're not going to go on the journey.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and there's a cost too to to any kind of, it's like in the real world, and this is the the stint I did in ecology coming out as well. There's always a cost, whether it's energetic, whether it's if you're an animal, and there's a really great berry patch. Well, yeah, that the benefit is you could get a lot of energy from those berries. The cost is that there are some eagles flying overhead that can see you. So,
yeah.
and I kind of apply that to anytime I'm writing something supernatural. If you're getting a really cool power, well then there's got to be some kind of a cost thrown in that mix. And again, that organizational balance, it really draws me to I think to the fantasy world.
Excellent. Well, okay, first of all, thank you so much for sharing with me today. This has been so fascinating to kind of hear how your scientific mind helps you bring these extraordinary ideas to life. So please tell us all where we can find you, where we can find your books, and of course, I'll include the links below.
Sure. You can find me at www.kristicharish.com. On Twitter at Kristi Charish, on Facebook at Kristi Charish Author, and on Instagram at Charish Kristi, just to be a little different.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. And thank you all out there in the interweb. Thanks for tuning in. And I'd like to challenge you to do something you never thought you would do. Let us know what it is in the comments and where it leads you. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a beautiful day.